Hey everyone, and welcome to the Skeletal Muscle lecture for this chapter. Before we kind of dive into things, I just want to categorize our topic and try to give you an idea of exactly how skeletal muscle fits into the body overall. First off, there are three types of muscles in our body, okay, or three tissue types, I think would be a better way to set it in your mind. So we have cardiac muscle, which is found in the heart. We have smooth muscle, which is found in your digestive tract. And then we have skeletal muscle, which is in our working muscles in our body that help move us, okay? So skeletal muscles produce movement. They have a few other characteristics such as being striated and multinucleated, and what those are describing is some of its setup, okay, or how it looks at a cellular level. But the most important thing for you to know is we have skeletal muscle that attaches from one bone to typically a different bone and then contracts and causes some sort of movement. Okay. So before we dive into the macro anatomy of skeletal muscle, so that's the things that you'll typically be able to see from a larger view, as if you're doing like a dissection. We'll then have a second or a part two of this that looks more at the micro. We'll start off giving an overview of both, so you'll be able to see and kind of put everything into place from macro to micro level. But again, the important thing here is to remember the context that our skeletal muscle moves us around, okay? So let's take a look at what it looks like, all right? Now, when we look at the anatomy of a skeletal muscle and trying to put context around this as to why you need to know it, whenever we look at structure, it always explains function. So that's so true across all biology, biochemistry, chemistry. It really comes down to structure as function. So when we're looking at this, try to keep in mind that yes, these are anatomical features you'll need to know and memorize and understand, but they also have a deeper structure to explain why muscle functions as it does. Okay, and where we're heading to with these video lecture series is to explain how the structure of this muscle produces movements and performs great feats of athleticism that we typically associate skeletal muscle with. Okay, so again, if we'll just start off getting orientated with this, again, going from a macro to a micro level. You can see that this component here, where it says skeletal muscle, is kind of the macro level of our skeletal muscle. And this transection and these images that are kind of expanded and blown up are actually, they actually get smaller and smaller. It's just this diagram or image shows them larger and larger, getting closer so that we can see what's going on. So you can think that each level that is illustrated here, 1, 2, 3 farther illustrations, they're magnified to greater and greater degrees, to the point where down here we're at a very, very small level. We're talking about strands of amino acids that comprise into very, very small proteins that that we wouldn't normally be able to view unless under a microscope. Okay. All right, so with that kind of context set, let's dive into some of the terms and anatomical structures here. So we have our skeletal muscle as a whole here, but what connects the skeletal muscle to bone is actually a component called tendons. Now, tendons are connective tissue, and they're really, really important. We'll get to discuss them at the end of this segment. As we look at this transection or this chopped skeletal muscle, we can see that the neck segments are composed of fascicles, which are smaller components of these larger groupings of muscle or of muscle fibers, which we can see is the next level that everything is grouped together. Okay, and then the last tube, if you will, is a myofibril. All right. Well, how do we figure this? Put this all together in our heads. What's going on here? Well, one of the things about tendons and connective tissue is they truly help wrap, kind of like a saran wrapping, around all of these bundles of muscle fibers to help hold them together in different layers. So, for example, let's start here at the actin myosin level. So these two terms are describing the strands of proteins, and we'll get to these. They're going to be really important when we're figuring out how muscles contract. But for now, we just know that this is a sarcomere, this kind of grouping of these two proteins. And then we have long strands of them, and those are grouped together in something called a myofibril. So you can think of that as like a very, very small, like one piece of a copper wire that you might find, like, say, in the wall of your house or something. But then we notice that there's a whole bunch of these myofibrils, or these little copper wires, encased in connective tissue, okay? And what we call that is the endomysin. So endo means in, so inside myosin. So it's the most inner wrapping that we'll find in a muscle, okay, in a skeletal muscle. So again, we have these copper wires, and we have this, saran wrap or plastic wrapping around the copper cables, okay? So again, this is how real wires are actually set up. You have lots of little copper wires wrapped in a plastic casing, okay? And that's to make sure the electrical signal doesn't get out and make contact with other wires in your home or other metal, let's say pipes or something, okay? So again, the endomysin wraps around the muscle fibers, or it creates a muscle fiber because it wraps around the myofibrils, right? Wraps around these. And then those muscle fibers are grouped together in fascicles, and they, again, have another wrapping around them. This one is called the perimyosum. So peri, is kind of beside. So we can think of in the middle. So again, we have these muscle fibers wrapped in another wrapping. And then bundles of those are then even wrapped farther in something called an epimysin. So this is the upper level wrapping outer sheath that kind of converges or connects to the tendon. Okay, so a lot going on there. I know we're going to divide this up into smaller components, but it's really, really important to understand that each of these segments in a skeletal muscle are kind of bundles on bundles and bundles around muscle fibers, okay, and these myofibrils. All right. One of my suggestions for how to memorize this is essentially just to rewrite and draw it. So actually try to draw the multiple levels and label them for yourself. And if you're able to do that from memory, it'll take time. You got to repeat it over and over, like try and check over and over. You'll get it for sure. But understanding these different levels of connective tissue and components that comprise the skeletal muscle is definitely important, okay? So again, just to kind of reiterate it, say it in a slightly different way for you and cover the same material. Tendons, so they're bands of tough fibrous connective tissue that connect muscle to bone. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about tendons and their structure towards the end of this lecture. Fascicles, they're small bands or small bundles of fibers, of muscle fibers. Again, hopefully you can follow along on a little picture that I include on the video for you, if you can see. If not, have the diagram for yourself at home. Muscle fibers, they're long multinucleated cells that generate force when stimulated, and we'll get to how that happens in one of the next videos. Myofibrils, those are the portions of muscles composed of thick and thin filaments, actin and myosin. They house sarcomeres, and actin and myosin are the contractile proteins in muscle. Again, we spoke to all of those. Hopefully you're able to landmark and locate all of those on the image again. Connective tissue and muscle organization. So the role of connective tissue, I think I didn't mention fully yet, but so part of it is to stabilize, support, and different components of skeletal muscle, and the other is to surround each level or bundle of skeletal muscle at different levels. And part of that helps just compartmentalize the signals in one component of the muscle and keep it separate from another part of the muscle. So for example, when your muscles go to contract, and we'll speak more to this later, the whole muscle doesn't contract, right? If you think about doing like a bicep curl, right? When you start lifting, your whole bicep doesn't necessarily start contracting. What actually happens is parts of the muscles start contracting. So some of the muscle fibers, not all of them. And then you recruit more and more and more. And the more you want to do contract your bicep, the more muscle fibers get recruited to contract. So keeping everything segregated a little bit and compartmentalized through connective tissue helps us contract with a bit more specificity of force rather than an all or none sort of generation of force. Okay, and again, as pointed out, the top or most outside layer is the epi or uppermost layer, myosin, epimyosin. We have perimyosum, which is the middle, so it covers the fasciculi, and then the endomycin is the individual muscle fibers that get bundled up. Okay, whew. Yeah, a lot of terms, some anatomy there, so pause, go back, get a little familiar, definitely draw it out, label from memory as best you can. Okay, so this is a very similar kind of cross-section. We can see the tendon attached to the bone and how that connective tissue kind of turns into and forms the epimyosin, and then we got our smaller bundles here. Okay, like if you're curious what it actually looks like in the body, because this is a bit of a idealized or stylized way. If you're to look at this muscle cross-section under a microscope, you would see something like this, okay? And so you can see the different compartments, the little muscle fibers in there, the endomycin wrapping around each of the muscle fibers, the perimyosum keeping the larger bundles of muscle fibers together, and then we have our whole fasciculal layer. Okay. Great. Yeah, so as promised, we're going to chat a little bit more about connective tissue and how that helps muscles contract and what's kind of special about about connective tissue that allows for muscle to act the way it does. And I think one of the important things to remember is that tendons act like specialized kind of shock absorbers to mitigate the force that muscles produce when they contract and ensure that they keep attached to bone or their attachment sites, right? So that's kind of the overall goal with tendons. So ultimately they are connective tissue, which again is kind of like stronger, more robust tissues, and they coalesce, which means they collect to form tendons kind of at the end of each muscle. So as you look here, it's this whitish tissue towards the end of the muscles. They attach to bone, and as I mentioned, they're really important for transferring the force generated from muscle to bones, and they act like a little shock absorber between the two. Okay. The epimyosin, like I mentioned before, it helps prevent the signal from that muscle spread to other muscles in the surrounding areas, and the elastic component of the connective tissue is really important. So, it is very strong and very robust tissue, but one of its properties is that it's elastic. So it has, again, as I mentioned, that shock absorption through that elasticity. And that kind of gives two helpful components to the structure of tendons. So one is the force and power production. So again, if you think of an elastic, you stretch out a rubber band and you let it recoil back. well, that's going to add force to whatever movement you're doing. Now, one way you can think of it is it's kind of free force, right? Yeah, you had to put in work to stretch out the elastic band, but once you let go and it contracts again, it isn't new energy you have to put in. So that's one thing that elasticity helps with. And as it mentions here, the stretch shortening cycle is really where that's most highlighted. So with an eccentric contraction, what happens is the muscle gets long as you're loading it up. So the muscle gets long, you stretch it out, the tendons get stretched, and then when you go to move or produce power or force with that particular muscle, everything contracts. Okay, that's both the muscle and then and pulls on the tendon. So I think when you're talking about a stretch shortening cycle or SSC, thinking about something like a squat jump or a counter movement jump helps in the sense that as you land, as you get into that knee bend and you load up quickly, so it's a quick drop into a loaded position before you jump up. What happens with that is, again, as you lower yourself down, all the muscles get long, so they're stretched, but you also load up the tendons with elasticity to jump up and then recruit some of that contractile force through that elasticity to add bonus power, bonus jumping height. Okay, we cover this in lab, so when we get to the muscle skeletal component, we'll cover that a little bit more and how that works. The second point here that isn't mentioned, but I want to speak to it, is the structure of tendons. You can think of them a little bit like a scrunchie, like a hair tie scrunchie. And the reason for that is they tend to crumple up in kind of like a wave function format. So they're not perfectly linear or straight like you might think of skeletal muscle as, okay? So skeletal muscles like this, and then your tendons kind of crimple up in a bit of a wave, okay, as if you're like crunching a can. So what that does is it allows a certain amount of lengthening happening without any tension or force or extra force being applied to the tendon itself. So it has this like crumple zone of bonus lengthening before you actually put any stress or strain on the tendon itself. So again, getting back to that concept that tendons are shock absorbers for all the forces produced by muscle. Okay, so that's it for the macro level. Again, we covered a number of important things. The main highlights for the macro level is knowing the terms for the connective tissue and the different levels of connective tissue of skeletal muscle, in addition to understanding what connective tissue does to help muscles transfer force is really important. And I guess secondly, when looking at skeletal muscle, knowing the different levels of skeletal muscle, both the macro and the micro, will get more specific into the anatomy and functioning of the micro level of skeletal muscles in your next lecture.